To discuss this further, we're bringing in Marcos Chatges, editor-in-chief of the Epoch Times Brazil and Latin America correspondent for the Epoch Times USA. So, Marcos, good to see you. Thank you for joining us today. And just as we've heard just now, we're seeing the United States granted temporary access to restricted areas in the Dominican Republic for refueling, right, and aircraft movement of the equipment. And this comes after the Secretary of War's visit on Wednesday. How are you looking at this? How are you reading at these visits to the region more broadly by Hegseth and others in recent days and weeks?
So recently, besides Defense Secretary or War Secretary Pete Hegseth, we've seen General Dan Kane going to Puerto Rico and Trinidad and Tobago, and other visits by U.S. officials. And really, the visits are just part of the broader development of U.S. military presence in the region. So we're talking 10 to 15,000 troops. The U.S.'s flagship aircraft carrier, Gerald Ford, is now in the Caribbean, and we're really seeing probably the largest military buildup in the region since the 1962 Cuba Missile Crisis, or even since World War II, maybe. Now, all of this has twofold implications. One, we're talking about actually fighting narco-terrorism and drug trafficking, and of course, it is a known drug trafficking route, the Caribbean into the United States. But then there's the broader geopolitical dimension to this. When we talk about Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, for instance, we're talking about countries that have been enablers of US adversaries in the region. Even if you talk about Russia and Ukraine, for instance, in 2008, Russia wanted to go into Georgia, so they did military exercises in Venezuela. Then Crimea 2014, and then Ukraine 2022. Again, we've seen kind of veiled threats in the sense that it would either be military exercises or they would send somebody to talk military affairs. And this operation has also the dimension of rolling back foreign influence in the region, and not only from Russia, but also from China and Iran, for instance.
So, can you go deeper on that point in relation to China in terms of this deployment of the Gerald Ford strike group in the Caribbean Sea?
Sure. So here's the way I look at it. When we talk about the Caribbean, we're talking about a very strategic region, for instance, for the Panama Canal. So one of the things we've seen amid the buildup is that there used to be a huge naval base, U.S. naval base in Puerto Rico called Roosevelt Roads. So this was basically, it fell into disuse in the early 2000s after the U.S. gave sovereignty of the Panama Canal back to Panama. And this, one of the things we've seen amid the buildup is these bases being reactivated. So this also means assuring the US has the capability of flowing ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and going even broader into this. Let's think about it from this angle. So we've seen throughout the past few decades the following. I'll try to be brief in each of those. So I talked about Russia. Let's talk about China. So right now in Peru, there's this huge port called the Shanghai port. It's basically Chinese built, and people say it can have dual use, so military civil use, which essentially means, it's a port that has Chinese influence and military capabilities in the US's doorstep. If you go to Argentina, you will see a space base, which is run by the People's Liberation Army, to the point that when it was being built, not even Argentine authorities could go in there without Chinese permission. I could go further, we've seen these countries shifting their main trading partner from the US to China throughout the region, to the point that now, if you exclude Mexico and Colombia, basically everybody has China as their largest trading partner. Um, some people say the US has been sleeping on the wheel, and this seems to be now a priority of the Trump administration. I mean, we now have Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State, and he's obviously the first Latino Secretary of State in the history of the United States. His parents are survivors from the Cuban Communist regime, which has been one of the largest enablers of US adversaries in the hemisphere. So, right now, what we're seeing is that the reinforced military presence in the region, in the US's near abroad, essentially serves as leverage to roll back foreign influence in the region and assert that the US has security in its near abroad. It's not only about warfare, but we can think about it in broader terms. For instance, China would need Brazil to provide food and iron ore in the case of an invasion into Taiwan. If the US has enough pressure, it might stop Brazil from doing that. If it hasn't, maybe it won't. So you start to see how the chessboard is kind of set up in the region.
A very comprehensive explanation, and I just like to, have our viewers understand the stakes here, the consequences. What would be the outcome if the Caribbean, in terms of the Caribbean, if China's influence in the region, along with Russia's and Iran's, was left unchecked? What would happen? What could that mean for the U.S. and rest of the free world?
Sure. So I'll give you some examples. I'll first talk about the ones that most directly threaten US national security, and then I'll branch out a little bit into the bigger geopolitical sphere of things. So when we talk directly about national security, for instance, in 2007, there was a threat of a terrorist attack into the JFK airport in New York, which the FBI debunked last minute. They almost blew up a big part of that airport. This was an attack which was directly connected to Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and it was developed through the Iranian network in Latin America. We're talking Guyana and Venezuela. Venezuela, for instance, has used state run airlines to ship in terrorists from Hezbollah into Latin America. When we talk about, for instance, the tri border area in Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, that's where, for instance, Iranian terrorists helped plan the 1992 and 1994 bombings of first the US, the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, the capital city of Argentina, and then in 1994, a Jewish community center. So, of course, this was an Argentine issue, but the 2007 planned bombing of the JFK airport was not. So you start to see how it can serve as a basis for operations. When we talk about the crisis in the southern border in previous years, we're also talking about the presence of these agents, of military-aged males, Chinese and otherwise, crossing the southern border in massive numbers. But then when we talk again about the bigger geopolitical sphere of things, we're also talking, like I said, about the US's capacity to stop countries from providing China with food and iron ore or other resources in times of war. So if there's a war over Taiwan, let's suppose the CCP invades Taiwan, this is the kind of threat that can be projected in the near abroad of the United States that could act either as dissuasion or even to make the US lose time as it tries to send reinforcements into East Asia. If they have a threat in the Panama Canal and the US needs to cross it with warships, that's also a problem. If Venezuela has a credible threat of, I don't know, helping in some way in a terrorist attack with Iran, like the 2007 JFK case I just mentioned, all of that composes a panorama where it would make it harder for the US to have quick response and be operational as soon as possible. So that's really how it plays out in the crisis.
Well, okay, Marcos, we always get valuable insight when we speak with you. Thank you very much for your time.
Always a pleasure.